Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob LaRocque. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Fuels Association and also the Chair of the Canadian Transportation Council under the Transportation Energy Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar, Get Future Ready, Preparing Canadian Fleets for Cleaner, Greener Operations, which promises to be an informative, insightful, and timely discussion. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Canadian Transportation Council is a national forum established under the Transportation Energy Institute. It brings together leaders and experts from across the fuel and transportation sector to foster a better understanding about the Canadian market and its evolution, while ensuring that our transportation system remains reliable, resilient, and efficient. We focus on collaboration, insight sharing, and solution building to address the challenges and opportunities ahead in the transportation industry. As many of you know, medium and heavy-duty vehicles play an essential role in keeping our economy moving. From delivering goods to supporting essential services, these fleets are the backbone of the Canadian transportation. But they also represent a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's why the road to a lower emission future must include thoughtful, practical strategies to support cleaner fleet operations. This webinar, Get Future Ready, is designed to help your organization better understand where we are today, what technologies and pathways are emerging, and how to take real, data-driven steps towards decarbonizing fleet operations. I also have to thank Natural Resources Canada for the financial support to this project. Our goal today is not just to share information, but to equip you with practical tools that can support decision-making and accelerate progress towards your fleet sustainability goals. Here's what we'll be discussing today. First, we'll introduce the Future Ready Fleet Initiative. This newly released guide to adopting low and zero emissions options offers a roadmap to select in action the right option for your fleet and cost savings, technology options, and real-world fleet case studies. Then we'll introduce the ALP Fleet Economic Insight Tool, a new resource designed to provide data-driven guidance and inform your decision-making as you plan your transition to cleaner operations. And finally, we'll follow up by running you through a number of scenarios to demonstrate how the Insight tool can help you assess both the economic and environmental impacts of different fuel and technology options. And finally, at the end, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. To lead us to this important discussion, I'm pleased to introduce our three outstanding experts today. First, we have Cara LaRochelle. Cara leads the Sustainability Mobility Team at Delphi, a Canadian strategic consulting firm specializing in climate change, sustainability, and ESG. Cara has assisted public and private sector organizations in reducing transportation emissions for over 2 decades. Joining us as well is Dr. Marc Salé, the founder and lead consultant of Mobility Futures Lab, a Canadian firm specializing in sustainable transportation. He develops data-driven tools and research to help government, fleets, and nonprofits plan for low-carbon mobility strategies. And finally, we're joined by John Heitberger, Executive Director at the Transportation Energy Institute. John is a longtime leader and advocate in the transportation energy space with a keen focus on enabling informed decision-making in a rapidly evolving market. Together, they'll help us unpack the opportunities ahead and guide you through the tools we're excited to share today. But just before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time in the chat feature. We'll be collecting them throughout the session. Once the formal presentations are concluded, we will hold a Q&A session and we'll moderate asking our experts to weigh in on the questions you have submitted. The presentations and the recording will be available and shared with everyone who attended. With that, let's dive in. I'll now hand over things to our first presenter, Cara, to begin our journey. Up to you, Cara.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that introduction. So we're going to kick this off today with a little bit of crowdsourcing. We have a poll for you. We are wondering about what your motivations are for decarbonizing your fleet. So here's how you answer. This poll is on Slido. If you have a phone, you can just scan that QR code that's up on your screen. It will take you straight to the poll. If you don't have access to a phone at the moment, you can go to slido.com. I believe Joe's also putting the link in the chat, and just enter in this code. And again, it'll bring you straight to this question. This is going to create a word cloud for us. So please feel free to put in as many sort of single word or short phrase answers that you'd like. You're not limited to one answer. So we know that people typically have more than one reason for thinking about this. So yeah, let's see what we get. Your responses will show up on the screen as you begin to enter them. Give you a couple of minutes for this. So we're seeing the theme of climate and environment, planet. I think we're saying almost the same thing in different words. GHG reductions. Oh, wow, lots here now. Environment, again, customers. I'll just give this about another, I don't know, 15 to 20 seconds. Okay, let's leave it at that. Okay, some good answers. And like I said, we're definitely seeing some themes in that. And, you know, these are that theme of sort of environment, GHG reductions, climate, our planet. That is, you know, I think probably what is the most important reason to decarbonize our fleet. So let's dig into that one a little bit more. If I could just get you to flip to the next slide. Medium and heavy duty vehicles have a disproportionate impact on our overall emissions. They represent only 17% of vehicles on the road, but they're responsible for 37% of transportation related GHG emissions in Canada on roads. So we really see how, despite the fact that there are fewer vehicles, they really have a big impact, not only on GHGs, but also on criteria air contaminants. They are a major source of nitrogen oxides and fine particulate matter in particular. These affect air quality and therefore public health. So this disproportionate impact means that companies who are looking to reduce their emissions get kind of an extra bang for their buck when they opt to decarbonize their medium and heavy duty fleets. And speaking of the bang for your buck, we know that the bottom line is of paramount importance for many of you here, and we will definitely get into the economics when we look at the calculator and review some examples a little bit later in the webinar. So why fleet decarbonization? For the environment, for climate, to reduce emissions, but why now? Again, I'll get you to flip to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We're pretty time limited today, but I will say that, you know, many of the reasons for addressing emissions that we just covered, they have some innate urgency associated with those. In addition, you know, some of those other reasons that we saw popping up on the screen when people were entering their comments, things like customers, many of you may be facing pressure from clients. We know that your scope ones are often their scope threes. Also from investors, if you're a publicly traded company, to reduce emissions. Also, some people are just looking to get ahead of regulations. We know that they're coming, and getting ahead of them, doing so now, sets you up to take advantage of incentives. So lots of reasons to jump into this now. So talking about the why, but what we want to focus on today is the how. So decarbonizing medium and heavy duty fleets, it's more complex than it is for light duty fleets. There's a lot more variation in vehicle types, in duty cycles, in operational requirements, you know, so much more so than in a light duty fleet. So this means there's not really an easy one size fits all option. So this is where the guide can really help. It is a step-by-step overview of that how. So together with the calculator, they're really meant to be a pair, and they really help. The guide helps to understand the calculator, and the calculator provides info to help feed into using the guide. So they really go hand in hand. So together, those can really help you to assess what technology options are viable for your fleet based on your actual operational requirements, what the transition would entail, and most importantly, what it would cost. The guide is laid out as an interactive roadmap. So it presents the information in layers. So we know that people are coming into this with varying degrees of background knowledge, various specific questions. So this sort of layering of information means that you can either easily get either a really high level overview or a deeper dive on any of the information that's covered. For today, we are going to zoom right up to the 10,000 foot level and just look at the fleet decarbonization journey. We're going to look at kind of planning and then implementation, but we're really going to focus on planning and specifically on the first couple of steps. We just want to give you a bit of a flavor of what this journey entails, especially when you're just starting out. So planning. The first step is always to understand your options. So the main options are here up on the screen, and a few key points. Number one, you'll see this covered in the black box. This isn't covered in the guide, but we just want to stress that the step one, the first step is always to try to reduce your overall energy consumption. So look at your logistics, maximize your efficiency before you start looking at changing the energy source. But, ultimately getting to that deeper decarbonization, it is going to involve changing the energy source. So there's two main categories that we're going to look at. So we've split it into like low emissions options or zero emissions options. So when we think low emissions, we're primarily looking at renewable fuels such as biodiesel and renewable diesel. And you'll see there's also hybrids and plug-in hybrids represented here. I will just say there are not as many options in the medium and heavy duty category as there are in the light duty vehicle category. So if you've not looked at this before, you'll see there's just a little bit less to choose from. So I'm going to really focus on the alt fuels, on renewable fuels in this little very blurb. So the reason that we put these under low emissions is because the actual emissions reductions that can be afforded by renewable fuels depends on a few factors, but chief among them is the blending ratio with regular diesel. So this can vary from under 5% biofuel or renewable fuel in diesel all the way up to 100% using it neat. But typically it falls somewhere within those two extremes, depending on the fuel, depending on the time of year, etc. So then moving across to zero emission vehicles, there are really two options here. We're looking at battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. And you'll see an arrow here from the alternative fuels and hybrids up to the zero emission vehicles. What we're trying to indicate is that these low emission options can be used as a stepping stone to zero emission vehicles or not. Like it doesn't have to be, depending on your goals and on your fleet. Some fleets stay with low emissions options and some skip them altogether and just go straight to zero emission vehicles. Either way, there are trade-offs, right? And you can see these are covered up top on this slide. So alternative fuels, they can be used in your existing vehicles. So that tends to lower the capital cost. You're not needing to buy a new vehicle for this. But the trade-off is that the emissions reductions are a little more limited depending on that blending rate. For zero emission vehicles, much greater emissions reductions potential here, but at a higher cost because we're talking about new vehicles, and not just new vehicles, but vehicles that come at a premium and that require charging or hydrogen refueling infrastructure. The other limitation here, and we'll get into this a little bit, and I think Mark will be talking about this when we get into the calculator as well, is that there aren't necessarily commercially available options for all vehicle types, which is actually a great segue to our next slide. So I'll get you to flip to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So not all options, well, I mentioned that there aren't necessarily commercially available options for all vehicle types, but also not all options are viable in all situations. So you really will need to assess these options based on your own fleet's situation. And we really are looking at these broad criteria. So, number one, commercial availability. Zero emission vehicle technologies are still relatively nascent, particularly in some of the heavier classes. So, elements like battery capacity and hydrogen storage, they're still evolving. In some applications, this means that there's more limited availability, and that'll be more apparent when we look at the calculator. But certainly some of the heavier applications, there's just less commercial availability. Second, compatibility with operational requirements. We're mostly looking at range and weight here. Many zero emission vehicles have higher they have higher weights. The vehicle just is heavier. And some have reduced capacity because of the battery and hydrogen storage tanks. So this can impact the maximum freight capacity or number of passengers. So this is definitely worth considering and assessing in your fleet's situation. It's also important to realize that geography, climate, requirements for additional energy, those all impact on the overall energy requirements and therefore also will impact the range. The last two, emissions reduction potential and the total cost of ownership, we're going to park those for now because we're going to be really covering those when we speak about the calculator, although I will say those are also really well covered in the guide. So I'll get you to flip ahead. Thank you. So once you have done this analysis, understood what the options are, identified which are viable options for your fleet, assess the economics and the emissions reduction potential of each, and then finally settled on one or maybe more than one options, then you start to become a little better positioned to establish some preliminary short and long-term targets. And I say preliminary because obviously there's testing involved, and those may change in time as you see how things work for your fleet. And then build out a roadmap to reach the targets. So implementing would typically involve planning pilot projects and then maybe tweaking those targets and maybe tweaking the roadmap based on the results. Procuring vehicles and the refueling or charging station infrastructure. So this means working closely with OEMs, utilities, infrastructure providers, and others, possibly things like completing required upgrades to your depot. Lots involved in that step. Training drivers and maintenance staff on the new vehicle operations. And then as your vehicles are deployed, monitoring things like fuel efficiency, emissions, operational impact, again, making decisions. This is based on those results. This is all very iterative. And finally, scaling the deployment based on lessons learned. This was a very whirlwind trip through a long and complex process. So as Bob noted, we have set aside time for questions at the end of the webinar. For now, though, I'm going to pass it on to Mark to walk you through the calculator.
Thanks, Kara, and good afternoon, everyone. Just before I start talking about the calculator that we developed, we're going to run a second Slido poll just to get a better sense of the alternative fuels the audience is interested in. So if you could just scan the barcode again, but this time you'll have to, just as you get in the app, make sure it's a bit less user-friendly than the first time, so you just have to make sure you can move the different options and rank them. So you should be seeing on your screen the 5 different fuel types that is also included in our tool. This is quite interesting to see battery electric at the bottom. I'm gonna wait another 20 seconds, just. All right. So we have, first option, renewable diesel, followed by hybrid electric, biodiesel, hydrogen fuel cell, and battery electric. So it's quite interesting to see that battery electric as a technology that had so much traction over a couple of years is now being listed last, with renewable diesel, hybrid electric, and biodiesel, the top three options. That's quite interesting and quite not surprising given the current economic context. So please, can you move to the next slide? So as Kara mentioned, as part of this project, we developed the guide that Kara just explained that gives fleet operator an understanding of what it means to deploy all these different technologies within their fleet. But in parallel to that, we designed a fully customizable decision support tool that helps you assess the financial and emissions impact of switching to an alternative fuel. So the way the tool works is that it allows you to select your vehicle type, the current fuel you're using, and the one you're thinking about switching to. And then the tool automatically gives you a list of all different variables that are important for a cost comparison, with default values based on industry averages. And all these values can be modified to adjust based on your local conditions. So we designed the tool based on a one-to-one replacement approach, which means that we're assuming that you're switching your existing vehicle with another vehicle that is an alternative fuel under a one-to-one ratio. The reason for that is that most government incentive programs right now only fund small pilots, so usually up to 5 to 10 vehicles. So instead of planning a full fleet transition, the idea here is to test alternative fuels by swapping out a few existing vehicles with cleaner ones using the exact same routes and operations. So this keeps things simple, lowers your risk, and helps you make the most of the funding that's already available. So in other words, this tool is built to support that early step as a stepping stone to a larger scale transition. So next slide, please. So what vehicle types does the tool support? So essentially, the tool covers pretty much all applications in the medium and heavy duty vehicle space, which we bucketed into three main options, which are passenger transport, so everything from school buses, transit buses, passenger vans, etc. Freight, so delivery vans, box trucks, tractors, and a number of other configurations, as well as specialized services, which in our case included waste collection and fire trucks. So the way the tool works, so for any vehicle type that you select within those, one thing about the tool, it will automatically filter out any alternative fuel options that are available. So as Kara mentioned before, for example, if you select as your vehicle type a small urban delivery van, then once you get to the point of selecting your alternative fuel, the tool will automatically filter out, let's say, hydrogen fuel cell, since it's a technology that is not commercially available for that vehicle type. Next slide, please. So this gives you, so here's how the tool works with the different steps listed here. So you start by selecting the province in which you operate, your vehicle type, the fuel type you're currently using, and the one you're thinking of switching to. And then from there, you can customize all the key operational details, such as fuel cost, maintenance, vehicle price, and infrastructure. And you can apply any incentives you're eligible for. So, and once you input all these values, you get two main outputs out of the tool. So a cost comparison and an estimate of the emission reductions. So this figure here shows you an example of the cost comparison. So what you're seeing here is an example of the cost comparison between a diesel and battery electric vehicles for a specific project. So the costs are estimated over the full ownership period, so however many years you plan to keep the vehicles. And each bar stacks all the relevant costs. So for the diesel, we can see fuel, maintenance, and vehicle cost. And then for battery electric, same thing, but now we have charging infrastructure that is added. And then if at any point while using the tool, you added any subsidies or incentives for the vehicle or for the infrastructure, then the tool automatically adds a third bar to show you how those incentives affect the business case. So this is the third bar that is shown here. So in this specific example, we can see that the cost of the project for diesel is lower than battery electric, but once we account for subsidies, the battery electric option becomes cheaper. So in addition to these to this cost comparison, you also get emission reductions. So you get greenhouse gas emission reductions, which impact climate change, as well as NOx and PM2.5 emissions, which are exhaust-related emissions mainly linked to diesel that have been shown to have health impacts. So I'm going to transition now to an actual demo of the tool just to show you how it works in practice. So you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Yep, great. So the tool is based on essentially two main components. So on the left side, we have a sidebar, and then on the right side, we have the main page. So starting just with the sidebar, so it essentially explains to you what the tool does, the fuel types that are included, and the different types of outputs that you get out of it. And then in addition to that, you get a table here that shows you the federal and provincial incentive programs that are available. So first of all, you get the federal MHDV incentive program, which is essentially tells you the maximum incentive that you can get per vehicle per weight class. And so this program is applicable to the whole medium and heavy duty vehicle space outside of public transit and school buses. And then below the federal program, we added all the provinces that have additional programs with a link. So you would have to go in and figure out how much of an additional stackable incentive you can add to the federal incentive for your use case. And I'll get back to that later on while I do an actual demo of the tool. And so in addition to the table here, you also have information about specific funding for public transit and school buses because it's a different funding stream. So getting into the actual tool, so the first step is to identify the market of operations where you operate. So for the province, we're going to use Ontario as an example. Then we get to selecting our vehicle application. So as I mentioned before, we have three options: passenger transport, freight, and specialized services. We're going to go with freight for the purposes of this example. Then as a configuration, we're going to go with the step van. That is class 3, so a small urban delivery van. Then we get to selecting our fuel type. So select your existing fuel type. We're going to select diesel. And then for the alternative fuel type, we have the option between biodiesel, renewable diesel, and battery electric. So just again to mention, if we had selected at the top here a tractor or, for example, a public transit bus, then when we come to this option of selecting the alternative fuel type, we would have more options because hydrogen fuel cell and hybrids are available for public transit, for example. So for the purposes of this example, we're going to go with battery electric. As soon as you select your base fuel and the one you're evaluating, the tool will automatically list for you the fuel efficiency for diesel, then for battery electric, that you can modify if you're not comfortable with these values. The next step is to select how many vehicles we want to purchase. So we're going to go with 2 just for this example. And then the tool lists for you operational conditions. So what's the daily distance traveled by your van? How many days per year does this van operate? And what's the lifetime of your vehicle? So how long do you plan to own these vehicles so that we can compare them in terms of costs? So we're going to keep these as default for now. Then we move on to financial assumptions. So discount rate, cost of diesel, cost of charging, cost of the diesel vehicle, and cost of the electric vehicle, which you can see is significantly higher than the diesel vehicle. All these are modifiable. Then we get to this cell that tells us to input any federal and provincial subsidy per alternative vehicle. So, and if we go to this question mark here, what it essentially tells us is to go back to the sidebar and figure out how many incentives this project would be eligible for. So because we're testing a class 3 step van, we would be, and it's outside public transit and school buses, we would be eligible to the federal program. So for a class 3 vehicle, we get $40,000 per vehicle. Now for this example, we're assuming we're in Ontario, which doesn't have a provincial program. So we're not going to be adding any additional funding, but then if you were in one of these provinces, you could go into the link and figure out how much you would be adding. We then are able to modify the diesel vehicle maintenance value or the electric vehicle maintenance value. And then you have a couple of additional variables that are optional for you to include. So vehicle insurance, vehicle resale value at the end of the lifetime, and vehicle financing. So we're going to keep these as 0 for now, just for the purposes of this example. And then we move to charging infrastructure. So for charging infrastructure, you get 2 options. Number 1 is to directly input your total charging infrastructure cost. So in this case, for your 2 step vans, you have a yard and you get an electrical engineering firm and they tell you that you need 2 chargers, this much for construction, and they give you a single quote for everything you need when it comes to infrastructure. So let's say that would be 55,000. So that's one option. You also have a second option to sort of do things yourself, more from the bottom up, to get an estimate. So under that option, you would get different charging station power levels, so options, going from 7 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. And obviously, the higher the power level, the faster the charging, the more expensive the charger. So in this case, you can select whatever charger you need. So in this case, we're just going to use 2 24 kilowatt chargers for this example. Same thing as before, it will add up your cost for the charging stations, so for the hardware. And then in addition to that, you have a cell where you can add construction and grid upgrades. So let's say we add that as 10,000 with a total of 56,000. Same thing as with the vehicles. This is where you can add any federal or provincial subsidy for charging infrastructure that we will keep at 0 for the purposes of this example. So this is where we move back to the actual cost comparison. So same figure as you saw on the slide deck. We have our diesel scenario, our battery electric scenario, and our battery electric scenario with subsidies. I used the exact same figure in the slide deck. So essentially, battery electric without subsidies was more expensive than diesel. But once we account for the $40,000 subsidy, we end up with a total cost for the project that is 5% less. In addition to this figure, you get another tab here that shows you the exact same results, but in a different way. So this shows you your cost of the project over time. So for red here, and for diesel represented here in red, you can see that at year 0, your total costs are around $150,000, which are the cost of the vehicles. And then over 10 years, you have the cost of fuel and maintenance. Now for the battery electric scenario, which is represented in green, so at year 0, your costs are $370,000 because the vehicles are significantly more expensive. And then you get fuel and maintenance over 10 years throughout the length of the project. And the 2 lines never intersect, which means that battery electric was always more expensive than diesel. But when we account for the scenario with the subsidies, so the green dashed line, we can see that at year 0, our costs are at $290,000 because we can subtract the subsidy, and then fuel and maintenance over 10 years. And we can see that the 2 lines do intersect at year 9, which means that if you do purchase your 2 step vans under all these conditions, and you run your electric step vans for 9 years, starting in year 9, your total cost of ownership running electric will have become lower than if you were running diesel. So this is a project where a business case could be made to run such a pilot. So in addition to the cost results, we also have the greenhouse gas emission reductions, which are based on how much we assume is emitted when you're charging a vehicle under the Ontario grid. So even for the emission factor that estimates the emissions that come from the electricity grid, the default value is also listed here that you can modify if you're not comfortable with it. And in addition to that, as I mentioned before, we get NOx emission reductions and PM2.5 emission reductions that have health impacts. So this gives you an overview of how you can use the tool for small-scale pilot applications. I'm going to pass it back to John to give you a couple of examples that were generated based on the tool.
Thanks, Mark. And we'll get the other slides up here. So I've spent a lot of time playing with the tool that Mark just walked us through. I think one of the key things is how customizable it is. So as he mentioned, there's a lot of default values in there, but you can go in there and customize how you run it. And what I have learned from it is it's a great tool to give you kind of an idea of what the costs are, but because you can customize it, there's a way to use it to help reduce the cost of transition to something. So you can go in and say, I need to have my cost of vehicle purchase needs to come down 10% to break even. If you're in negotiation to buy a vehicle, you can use the tool to show exactly what price point, what delta, what financing terms, what type of adjustments to the default you need to make the numbers work financially for you. So I spent a little time, went through 4 different scenarios. I'm just going to walk through what those are so you get an idea of what the impact is. So the first one I did was, let's say we're in Alberta, we have a Class 8 diesel tractor we want to replace with a hydrogen fuel cell. What does that look like? So I used mostly default values in the tool, but you're looking at replacing one vehicle. The default value is 370 kilometers a day. Operate the truck for 10 years. Default diesel price, default hydrogen price there in that first box in the middle. Then you look what the efficiency is, and you start seeing what the various inputs are. In this scenario, a diesel tractor to purchase will be $175,000. To purchase a fuel cell tractor, $485,000, but you get a $200,000 federal subsidy. So that is factored in there. Did not factor in any financing. Just wanted to see what the cash cost would be. But again, you can go back and say, what if I finance it over this period of time at this interest rate? You can take a look at if I'm buying hydrogen in the market, which is the model I use, which is the default hydrogen price. But if you want to install your own refueling depot, you can insert that data to customize that. Ultimately, it came out that the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is going to cost about $740,000 more than the diesel tractor over 10 years. So clearly some changes would need to be made to the economics to make that pencil out, but you can also look at the emissions impact. Now, the hydrogen price is the default, but you'd have to take a look and see what your actual hydrogen prices are if you want to use gray, blue, or green. And you can see a significant CO2 equivalent emissions delta for the type of hydrogen you're going to use in that tractor. Let's take a look at the next scenario. In this one, we said, okay, we have a Class 8 diesel transit bus in Quebec, and we want to replace it with a hybrid transit bus. Again, one vehicle, 199 kilometers a day. The typical operating range of this is 14 years. So that's the default value we used. You take a look at the cost of the energy, it doesn't change. The vehicle uses the exact same fuel, but it gets more kilometers per liter. So you see the delta there in terms of efficiency. The price delta is about $236,000, and from the tool, I did not see a subsidy associated with a hybrid purchase. Again, we're going to cash purchase it, but we can include the financing if you want. We're not going to put in any energy infrastructure because we're going to use the exact same infrastructure we're using for our traditional diesel powered bus. The impact on the economics is that we're going to pay about $113,000 more for the hybrid bus than we would for the diesel bus over the period of time, but we're going to save 188 tons of carbon equivalent. So you're starting to see cost benefit analysis. Scenario 3 on the next slide is an Ontario operating a delivery van company. Think about an Amazon delivery van you see in residential areas, replacing it from a gasoline powered van to a battery electric vehicle. And we're going to say we're going to swap out 4 of those, just because you're running these distributing these this type of distribution. You're going to need more than 1 vehicle to really test it out, and 4 vehicles will help you justify some installation for chargers at your depot. So we're going to say that we're going to replace 4 vehicles, class 2, travel 95 kilometers a day, operate for 10 years. My computer wants to do a restart here, so I'm going to try to stop that. Energy cost, you're looking at $1.46 a liter for gasoline or 10 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. You see the efficiency there. There's a $10,000 per vehicle subsidy. And so that helps offset the $24,000 premium for the battery electric vehicle. We're going to pay cash. But in this situation, we're going to install our own chargers. So for this model, I said, let's put in 2 50 kilowatt dual port chargers. So if we want to charge all 4 vehicles at once, we can. They're only driving 95 kilometers a day. So a 50 kilowatt charger will easily recharge those vehicles in less than overnight without a problem. And we're going to put those in. It's going to cost about $92,000. In that situation, with the subsidies over 10 years, the battery electric vehicles will cost $140,000 less than the gasoline vans. We're actually going to break even in 5 years with the subsidies, and we're going to save 535 tons of CO2. So you start seeing how this tool can really figure out what makes sense economically. And the final scenario we ran here was in British Columbia, taking a diesel box truck class 6, replacing with start running on B20. It's going to take 1 vehicle, and again, you got to think about this. We're just switching fuel. So in this model, what we could have done is said we're not even going to spend any money on a truck. But let's say we're going to buy a new truck. We're going to drive 100 kilometers a day, run it for 10 years. The average diesel price, $1.81 a liter. Average B20 price, $1.90 a liter. Obviously, those vary depending on your market. Same fuel efficiency, same vehicle costs. Nothing changes in terms of the cost or the energy infrastructure necessary. The B20 is going to cost at this price point about $5,900 more over 10 years than the diesel vehicle, and save 35 tons of CO2. Again, this is going to be completely contingent upon the price of diesel relative to the price of B20, but everything else is pretty much the same, but you're going to be saving emissions there. So we saw in the Slido poll earlier, renewable diesel, biodiesel are some high interest areas. It is clear that the upfront cost is negligible. You need to be paying attention to what is that purchase price of the fuel, because that's going to be your delta in financials. But will be seeing a reduction in overall carbon emission reductions. So again, the tool that Mark walked you through, it's a lot of fun to play with. I put a link to it in the chat. Just hop on and start playing with it. See what you can do. See what flexibility there is. If you are actively considering going to a lower emissions vehicle, this tool can really help you figure out what that cost might be. Pay attention to local costs, local market conditions on energy, on vehicles, on incentives. The tool will help you find the incentives, but really pay attention to the overall impact. Question in the chat was, does the report kick this out? No, I pulled all this out and sent it over to our design firm to put together the infographics. But the results that Mark showed you with the summary and the charts are on the tool. So it is it's a great tool. And I really encourage you guys to play with it as much as possible. And with that, I think we're open up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, John, Karen, Mark. I just want to highlight a little bit for everyone. There was a comment in the chat about a report from the Ontario government on heavy and medium duty vehicle from 2022. So thank you for sharing that. That's the point of the council, that we always try to look at all of the research out there and evolving. And on that note, Mark, one of the question that is there a plan to update the tool, just because we've talked a lot about incentives, and there was a comment in the chat about maybe the regulations won't go through in certain provinces, and maybe the subsidies depending on the outcome of the election. So how easy and how could we go about updating the tool?
Yes, that's a great point. So what we did it on purpose to put all the incentive programs in the sidebar and not directly input any subsidies on the main page of the tool. The reason for that is that these subsidy programs change over time. So it will be easier for us to update that sidebar and just keep it up to date on existing subsidies and letting the users add themselves any incentives that they get for their project into the main component of the tool.
Thank you for that. If there's any other generic question, I do appreciate the one-page summary, Morgan. I think we all like what John did. It's just we couldn't come up with 80 different scenarios. So, but we tried to provide a visual report as part of the tool that then can be. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the results can be downloaded, I think, into Excel or.
The figures can be downloaded directly from the page.
Perfect.
I'll also share, I played with it as well. There's a record function. So if you're running scenarios and you want to understand what all the adjustments you made, you can record your session while you're filling in the tool. So you can always go back and see, how did I do that? What was the variable that I changed? You can always go back and look at it. But when you're done, you can print off a report. It's not going to come up that colored one, but it's going to give you a listing of all your inputs and all the outputs, so you can keep track of the results you're generating.
Just going to give everyone maybe another minute or two if you have any questions. As those are coming in, I know we had a certain time, but Kara, Mark, John, is there an additional point or two that maybe we can emphasize or you kind of missed as you were presenting? You want to share?
Well, I think my perspective on this from the Transportation Energy Institute's world is there are a lot of motivations that Kara mentioned early on why you might want to seek a lower emission vehicle, whether it be regulatory compliance, whether it be reducing your scope emissions, whether it be a B2B relationship, maybe be altruism. But ultimately, we have to make for businesses, you have to make sure that the economics line up with your objectives. And I think the guide really helps you understand what your options are, and then the tool helps you measure what those options mean from a cost and emission standpoint. So whatever the motivation is, there's great opportunities here to use the two resources to really help guide your evaluation and help you reach a more informed decision going forward.
So I do have a question from Mr. Jeff Ovey.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation. I would just wanted to add my experience with working with fleets over the past couple of years is that up to this model and this guidance and this tool being available, most fleets have been taking a shotgun approach, right? They're hearing something, they're reading something, so then they have to go out and buy 5 vehicles, and then they very expensive, and then they pilot test it to see if it meets their requirements. And the feedback that I've been getting so far from fleets is that people wish they would have had this 2 years ago. It is that helpful in making sure that you've got a team in place that's intelligently talking about this, and then you've got the tools to help support any decision-making process, internal selling, if you will, to make sure everybody in the company understands the direction you're going and what those costs may be. So that's just some of the feedback we've gotten so far, and hopefully we can prevent that shotgun approach stuff where we're just randomly having to spend money, and of course that's really only the privilege of a very large fleet that's got some disposable income that they can throw out and do that. So good job. This thing is fantastic, and it's going to get a lot of miles, I'm sure. Thank you. That's all I had to say.
Thanks, Jeff.
And Ian Thompson, Advanced Biofuels Canada, great job to Delphi and the Mobility Futures Lab and to TEI and CTC for overseeing. I think it's going to be a really helpful tool, and there are a number of fleet folks that I look forward to sharing it with. Just kind of a note, there may be some utility in having a resource section that points to costs, people who don't have access to wholesale costs, et cetera. If you're a fleet operator, the ability to go to a rack price, Valero posts its rack prices, Shell, Suncor, others do. Valero, interestingly, posts R99 at parity to ULSD on its Montreal rack. So information like that's useful. And I don't think I see in the model kind of any assumptions around the credit value. Correct me, Mark, if that is available, credit values that are available under some provincial programs as opaque and as hard to discern whether they're real or not. Is that a feature in the model?
No, not really. Like, we use provincial averages, but at the end of the day, this is something that we do mention as a hint in the tool, that you need to contact your fuel provider to get your up-to-date price. The numbers for that in the tool is a proxy just to give them a sense of the premium. But it would be too difficult to have a number that is constantly updating, especially given everything that is moving right now.
Yep, and that's a fair point. It would be a very rare fleet, and probably only a very, very large international fleet that might be in a position to actually monetize those. It's going to be, and Bob knows from him, remember, those values will be embedded in the price that the fleet buys its low carbon fuel for, because the seller is needing to monetize those reductions to be able to sell the fuel and generate its obligations. So I think you're fine. I'm not suggesting it should be in there. It's just a question about whether it was.
Ian, your comment that the wholesale cost of our RD99 is on par with diesel. I went back to the tool and said, okay, what if you switch to Class 8 tractor trailer in British Columbia from diesel to RD99, and there was no cost delta in the fuel? Clearly, the operating costs over time are the exact same. That fuel switch saved 887 tons of CO2 emissions. And so
and that is the case, John.
Yeah, that is. I mean,
that's the case.
Start thinking about that. That's a huge bang for your buck, because you're not spending any more money. You're having a huge impact on the environment. So something to keep an eye on, everybody.
Yeah, so it's an interesting, and that is the case when we've worked with a number of large fleets in BC that have adopted RD. What you're describing is exactly the case. So people shouldn't, it's not that RD, renewable diesel, biodiesel, or any of these don't cost something. It is that the cost, if you provide RD9 or R100 at rack at parity, the fleet operator doesn't pay any more. It's spread across the whole pool of users. There's no free lunch for any of these fuels, but it's how an obligated party quite reasonably determines to market something that it needs to get out there to generate its compliance credits. This is the elegance of these market-based mechanisms like a low carbon fuel standard or a CFR.
And then I'll turn it over to Jeff for one last question or comment, and then we'll close out the webinar.
Sorry, one last one, guys. And I think one of the things when Mark and Cara were working on this, and the importance of trying to figure out what is that cost of carbon, right? So if you're a very large publicly traded company or multinational company, and you find yourself that you're in a position where you can either spend the CapEx and invest in this area and show those incremental improvements on carbon, or maybe your alternative is you have to go out into the market and buy carbon offsets under a different type of program. So I think that's why the discussion and bringing in the carbon discussion on a per vehicle basis is so important, because one way or the other, you're probably going to have a cost, and one way you can control it a little bit better. I would add that, we've been asked to do some voluntary carbon market methodology work for electric vehicles. So we're very much aware of what those costs are. And I just wanted to again say thanks for a great project.
And Bob, one last comment, I'll turn it over to close this out, is this is really quick. We were so impressed with this project that we actually had Cara and Mark create one for the United States as well. So if you're operating both sides of the border, we have this tool, which is Canadian market specific, Canadian inputs and metrics. And we have one coming out next month for the US with US markets, incentives and metrics. So trying to create a North American tool to help fleets really decide what their best path forward would be. So with that, I'll shut up now, Bob.
Well, you led me through my closing remarks, John, so I really appreciate it. So just to respect everyone's time, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. I hope that this webinar was insightful. And I'll just put a little bit of a plug there. If you haven't been yet, please go look at the Transportation Energy Institute website. Not only are you going to find information about this project, but there's a lot of other work being done by the Institute across the transportation sector that is extremely helpful. And one last plug is that if you are interested in joining the Institute and being part of the Canadian Transportation Council, there's also information on the website, and we would welcome people to join us. And finally, I just want to say a big thank you to Kara, John, and Mark. Thank you very much for your presentation today, and I wish everyone a happy Easter. Until next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.